It's been said that every quilt tells a story, and it's so true. But I also believe every quilter has a story to tell. I wanted to hear about the people behind these wonderful quilts and thought you'd enjoy hearing about their lives also. Welcome to A Quilter's Life. Sondrasa has found quilting to be the perfect palette for her creativity. Playing with the mediums of fabric and thread to create her own unique brand of fabric art for international quilt shows, and also creating her own quilt patterns which are designed to help even a confident beginner create beautiful quilts. Sondrasa sees every quilt as a work of art, knowing that the maker has made it out of a labor of love. Sondrasa, thank you so much for joining me on A Quilter's Life.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Tell me how you found out about A Quilter's Life.
Well, I found out about A Quilter's Life from my friend Mel. She's such an amazing art quilter, and I am a part of a small group of professional quilters who meet on Mondays and do what we call a body doubling. And so it just kind of helps us all kind of work and be motivated. And she's been just talking about her experiencing with the podcast, and it sounded like something fun to do.
Great. I enjoyed hearing Mel's story. That was a fun one. Well, let's jump back and talk about you. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Southern California, actually. Little town against the foothills called Glendora. Not many people know about it.
So share a childhood memory.
Since you brought up California, where I was from, and right now there's a lot of wildfires going on, I actually grew up in Glendora, but right next to the UFS station, Big Dalton Station. And my dad was a captain of the fire truck there. So he would always go on the wildfire calls and everything like that. So I remember a lot of fond memories since we lived right next door to the station of like going over and playing on their obstacle courses and just getting into all sorts of hijinks. It was a lot of fun growing up. Because when you're used to like suburban life, but then you're like living against the mountain and like doing hiking trails and being chased by coyotes.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, there was a time where my friends and I, oh goodness, I must have been like 9 or 10, and I'm the oldest of my sisters, and my neighbor, he was about 12. We went, like we do, into the back areas, and there was this water treatment facility that had these beautiful sunflowers, just wild sunflowers growing all around the like industrial ponds kind of thing. And we were just kind of walking around and kind of just looking at the sunflowers. And there was a coyote at the end of the walkway that spotted us. And it's like me and my 2 sisters and him and his 2 sisters. And we sprinted as soon as that coyote started chasing us. We were out. It was like, oh, no, wait, maybe we shouldn't be doing this anymore.
Wow. Anything else about your childhood or growing up?
I was very fortunate to grow up where I did. We were relatively lower income compared to like the rest of the city because my dad worked for the fire service and all that. So I was very fortunate to have a lot of experiences. I marched in the Rose Parade with my high school. I sang at Carnegie Hall with the National Children's Choir. And I had a lot of fantastic experiences because my parents put me out there and gave me opportunities. You don't, as a kid, really think about how fantastical these things you're doing. And then you get older and you're like, oh, well, maybe I should reach out and say thank you to my parents again. My mom, she made clothes for my sisters and I, and, you know, there were a few play quilts. And so I never really thought much of it at the time because I actually would get really upset whenever she'd make us outfits because then we were triplets. We were all so close together. And looking back, it's like, oh, these are really cute. And really, she did it because it was saving money because we really couldn't afford to buy even Walmart clothes back then was like expensive. So just kind of seeing the juxtaposition of the kind of childhood I had, but the things my mom would do to be able to give us that opportunity.
Yeah, as parents, we don't want to put a burden on our kids. So the kids really don't know. We don't know what they're going through. Well, other than quilting, have you had other employment?
Oh, yeah. I've held quite a few different jobs in my life. I went to college at Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. To do that, I worked 2 jobs and went to school full time. And so I worked, I think it was 7 or 8 years. I worked at a Walmart deli. I was in charge of like food prep and all that kind of thing. So I did that for a long time. And then I also, I think it was about 15 years, I worked as an in-home care. Not a nurse. I was like right underneath that. I was taking care of disabled adults. I didn't have to have a nursing certificate or anything like that. Yeah, I worked a very long time doing that.
That is so needed.
It is, and very underappreciated, to be honest. And I probably would have kept doing it. At the time I was living in Pennsylvania, and I hit 7 or 8 years doing it, and I hit the max pay for that position. I didn't have any benefits, and I didn't have health care, and my husband at the time was epileptic, and I had my daughter who was just born, and I'm taking care of my mom who's disabled. You're doing this, and there was a time where, in the great wisdom of the managing company, they went from 21 places across the state to managing this to 3 to save costs and things like that. And in doing so, the company that I had been placed with decided they didn't want to pay us anymore. For about 6 months, I went without pay, and here I am with a new board and all this kind of stuff. And it wasn't just like me as the worker who was suffering, but everyone I was caring for. They can't afford us out of pocket, but they still needed care. These people needed us to help them shower, to cook them food, to get them to the grocery store even. And there were a lot of us, myself included, that just kept working anyway, because we knew that what else were our customers or people we were helping going to do, right? We were their only lifeline in some places. So it's a very much needed thing, and I think it's very unappreciated, like a lot of essential jobs are. I'd love to see that kind of work get more appreciation and be able to have a more livable wage and benefits. That's going down a rabbit hole. Anyway.
So where are you residing now, and how did you get there from California?
I always chuckle when I think about that, but I live right now outside of Denver, Colorado, in a city called Aurora. I'm really happy here. When I was 18 in Southern California, I graduated high school. I'm like, you know what? I want to get out of here, and decided that I was going to take on some nanny work in central New York, and just yeeted across the country, and just about 2 years there. And they moved from central New York to Pennsylvania, and I went with them because where else was I was supposed to go? I was 19 with like nothing. So I worked there and decided, you know what? I want to go to school. I want to actually pursue my dreams. And at the time I wanted to be an art teacher, and went to school at Edinburgh, Pennsylvania, and lived in Pennsylvania for a good almost 15 years before moving out here. Right before COVID hit, I moved out here in end of 2019, almost.
What a welcome. You move across the country and then you get stuck in the house.
It wasn't too bad. Growing up in California and used to the traffic, and then Pennsylvania and like central New York and all that, there's hardly any, right? The freeways are pretty much open. And when they complain about traffic, you kind of just scoff. And then moving back out to the Denver area, I knew that the traffic would be bad again. But then COVID hit and the freeways were open. It was like really surreal.
Anything else you would like to share about your family?
Well, I have 2 darling kids. My daughter, Elaine, she's 12 now. Super bright, smart as a whip. And then I have an ornery little 4-year-old named Xander. Love him to death. He's more like me in every way. They're fantastic. And my partner, Luke, and he's super techie. And we're just a bunch of happy nerds. We sit around watching anime and playing board games and stuff like that. And like, what more can I ask for?
I noticed that you say you're a quilter by day and nerd at night. I think that might fit in right here.
Yeah.
So can you describe the nerd at night?
Nerd by night. So I am a quilter. I say by day, but really quilting takes over my life all the time anymore. But nerd by night kind of refers to the fact that I do love to watch anime and play video games and all that kind of stuff. And I do from time to time stream over on Twitch, which is generally a gaming platform, but I stream my quilting and sewing stuff. So I tend to be more tech savvy and just more into pop culture than I think some people are.
Well, thinking about the generations to come, how do you think they will describe you?
Oh, goodness. If I'm lucky, they'll describe me as eccentric. I always like to be the quirky one and kind of just different. So that's what I'm hoping is like if somebody looks back at what I do and who I am, they'll think, wow, she was a real nerd. Like she is a quirky woman. I'm like, yeah, I would love that. That would be my happy legacy.
Nice. And if you wanted to leave a message for your future generations, what would you want to tell them?
Well, that one's easy. I would tell them to be unapologetically you. It took me 30 years to finally be comfortable with who I am and what I do. Wearing purple lipstick and having blue hair, and even in my 30s, was a weird thing to do. And it's funny because I'll go to events with other quilters and they'll look at me and they'll be like, I've always wanted to dye my hair pink. I've always wanted to do that. And I'm like, why don't you? Oh, I can't. Oh, one thing or another that gets in the way. And I'm like, you should. If that's something you want to do to express yourself, do it. Right? Like, I'm tired of fitting into people's molds.
Yeah. Besides quilting, are there other crafts that you do?
Well, I definitely have been guilty of craft hopping. Before I landed on quilting, I was always jumping from crocheting and knitting, making socks, and oh, let's try scrapbooking, and oh, how about some polymer clay, and just jumping from craft to craft. And it wasn't until I landed on quilting that I found something that kept my attention longer than 6 months. And I haven't really gone back to any other craft besides quilting since.
So quilting has taken over. You don't have a secondary craft going on the side?
Not really, because for me, quilting is so expansive. I do a lot of art quilting, and then if I'm tired of art quilting, I'll jump over to traditional piecing. I have a quilt in the works for my daughter that I've been working on for 3 years. Don't tell her. I'll get it done eventually. But then in the place of where maybe I might crochet or knit to keep my hands busy, I have English paper piecing now, which is just another quilting technique. So I have all these different things to keep me occupied where I don't need another hobby in my life.
Well, quilting does have so many different steps, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it does. It takes different aspects to do each step. How about other hobbies?
I am a huge Lego nerd. My studio, my house, everything. My grandparents and my mom had ceramic knickknacks on shelves. My family and I, we have Lego sets. We have a giant Harry Potter castle that sits in front of the TV on the entertainment stand and all these different Lego sets kind of decorated around. And that's our big hobby when I'm not doing like normal mom things or quilty things.
And Legos can be fun to do together.
Really, really. And, you know, we're even getting our 4-year-old involved now. And so now he's got his Lego sets, like little monster truck Lego sets that he can race. And it's just a lot of fun. And it gets their brain like working in a different way. And then they're physically making something. I think that's something that a lot of us have lost, is that wanting to create something physical.
Mm-hmm. So how do Legos show up in your quilting?
That's a hard one. I don't really think right now they show up. There's a lot of like things I'm passionate about and nerdy for that I can't really include in my quilting, mainly because it's a copyright issue or it's a technique issue. I have one quilt that I'm working on behind the scenes that I won't write a pattern for and I won't mark it as anything, but it's based around Pokemon. And my partner loves Eevees, which is like a little fox Pokemon that has all these different forms. And I'm making this huge circular, almost like a mandala quilt kind of thing, where each section will be like its own scene and applique. And that's kind of my passion project. But again, I could never write a pattern for that or anything like that because there's so many copyright and written issues with it.
Yeah. And what I'm seeing is with Legos, you're building a base and you're building on that base, which may be similar to what you're doing with your art quilts of building a base and
I think it really
filling that
depends, right? Because it really just depends on what you're working on, right? Like I have a set that has a base, but you don't really make that base until the end. Other sets, you're working on different parts. And you're still building up, like with an art quilt. I do a lot of art applique. And I don't start with my base. I start with the parts. I start with the smaller parts so I can then build them onto the bigger parts and then build those onto the bigger parts. And then it ends up this big old layered system. And then I can add it to my base. My base is really my last part.
Oh, interesting. Because I watched one of your videos where you were time-lapsing drawing. And so I made an assumption that that was your base, and then you built up from that with the fabric.
There's a huge difference in my process of drawing versus my process. I draw it, and that's a lot of the work. When I go to actually making it, I've already figured out how everything, because I like to say that applique is like a paint-by-number puzzle, right? Drawing is just figuring out how the pieces and how everything fits together. And as soon as I get to that part, and even then, I may draw a general, all right, this is going to be my ground and this is going to be my sky, and then draw all my elements. And then, okay, well, the background looks really dull. I better add some clouds. And then I go back into it. That's kind of the way my brain dissects it.
Cool. Let's jump over to who introduced you to quilting?
Like I mentioned before, my mom was a big sewer, and my grandmother and my great-grandmother were also seamstresses and things like that. And I have stories that my mom's told about, like my great-grandmother. They lived in the South, and she lived in this small wooden cabin. And when all the ladies would come down and they had an actual frame hooked from the ceiling that they'd pull down, and she'd tell me stories like that, but I really didn't think much of it. It was always just kind of something in the background, having play quilts at the park and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until I was in college, it was my senior year of college, and I was taking a block printing course and just playing around with colors and patterns. And my mom had started getting back into quilting. She was watching some Sewing with Nancy and Fawns and Porters and stuff. And she pulled me over one time for this one episode, and it had Tulip Pink on it. And she was making that modern cornrow quilt. It was right when she was launching Parisville, and it was this really modern take on what a quilt could be, and her fabric was just so bold and intense, and it just hooked me. It was like everything that quilting I wanted it to be, but I never thought it was. Because like I still remembered back in the 90s when my mom would go to the fabric shops. You know the smell. You walk into these old fabric shops and you just smell. I'd hide in the fabric racks and things like that. And the thought then of what quilting was in the 90s to what quilting was in like 2011 was such a huge difference. And so I finished school and I had gone for woodworking and ceramics. And I loved doing those, and they were more craft-centric arts, right? But I couldn't afford to start my own studio, right? Trying to buy a bandsaw or a table saw or a kiln was just not in my price range. But quilting was in my range. My mom had plenty of sewing supplies that I could just go and play around with. That's kind of what like drew me in, was the accessibility and just what quilting had become, what fabric had become.
It's hard to remember back sometimes to those days that we didn't have all the accessories and tools we have today.
My mom told me a great story back when she was working. She was like, do you know that the rotary cutter is a relatively new tool? I'm like, what are you talking about? You've always had a rotary. She's like, no, it used to be like sewing patterns and you had to use your scissors. And I'm like, that just feels archaic to me. Like, how could you not function without a rotary cutter? And we just take for granted all those kinds of things and the tools and the irons and just how much nicer everything is. More expensive, sure, but like so many more accessibility options for people.
Yeah. And people that have given up on it some because they couldn't continue doing some of those tasks, they can do it again. Do you happen to have a favorite quilt, whether it's one you made or that someone else made?
So a favorite quilt, I'd have to pick something that my great-grandmother made, and I never met her, but she had gifted several quilts to my sisters and I when we were little. And there was this Christmas quilt that would always go on my bed at Christmas. And it had these little bears. They were appliqued on, but you could tell that the bear itself had been cut out of fabric and then just stitched down. And I remember that quilt, and I remember how soft it was, and I love that quilt. And it always stuck with me. And I have some quilts still. I don't have that quilt anymore. But they have such a lasting impression. And I even have some quilts that are tied. Like, you never see people making tied quilts anymore, but that was something my great-grandmother did. They're the softest, snuggliest quilts that I've ever had. And my kids use them on their beds now at Christmas time. And it just has a huge impact on us.
Yeah. And we talked about tools there just a minute ago. So what tool do you have now that you are so happy that you have?
Silicone mat, I think I'd have to answer. Because I do so much applique and I take for granted how easy that makes my life. Because I was going to say, I don't use many tools because I'm not a big ruler person or anything like that. But like, you can't catch me without my silicone mat.
Describe what a silicone mat is compared to, I know it's not the mat that goes with the rotary cutter, but describe it for me because I'm not quite sure what it does.
There's a couple different people out there that make them. Think of it kind of like if you do any baking, and sometimes they'll have those baking silicone mats that you'll put on the cookie sheet that help lift the cookies without using spray or anything. It's the same material as that, except that this silicone mat is clear. So if I'm doing applique, I have what is called like an applique layout guide that shows me where all the pieces go. So I'll lay that down, and then I put this clear silicone mat over that so I can see the lines. And I can use a light box or something underneath. And then that just lets me put my pieces where they need to be. And then the silicone mat is heat proof. So I can put the iron right on top and fuse my pieces down. If something slips or something doesn't work, then it's not adhered to the background fabric or it's not adhered to the larger piece as a whole. So I just have to let the piece cool and then I can peel it off and then it's just ready for another go and the next layer of the quilt.
Oh, cool. Wow. And like we mentioned, there are so many steps in our quilting. So do you look forward to each step along the way, or do you have a favorite step that you really look forward to?
I think my favorite step is cutting the pieces out after I've traced them. So for me in my applique, I've already drawn the image and I've reversed all the parts, and now I get to take whatever fusible I'm using, like heat and bond, and I can put it over my shapes and then trace them out. And then I get to sit there and cut them and then iron them to the fabric and then cut again. And that is a step that the cutting part, I can do from anywhere. So typically it'll be a chance for me to take my quilting outside of my studio and like go sit and watch a show with the kids or like have it in the car as long as I'm keeping myself organized. It's a moment where I get to zen and not have to think because I've already done a lot of the work ahead of time. And now I get to just enjoy the process. I don't really get to do that in any of the preceding parts because then I'm focused on making sure where the parts go or how it's going to be quilted. And that takes a lot more brain power, which there's nothing wrong with, but it's nice to find those moments of zen in my day.
So I'm curious, are you back to using scissors to cut out your pieces, or do you have another way?
I do use scissors. I'm sure most quilters have like 10 different pairs of scissors. but I use a special applique scissors. So it's smaller and they are serrated at a different angle, if that makes any sense, to make it more precise of a cut. So I always use my applique scissors.
I bet you get some tiny pieces that you're dealing with too.
I do.
Share your worst quilting experience.
So for a time before COVID, I worked as an art quilter, taking commissions from people. And that just kind of helped supplement my habit of quilting in my fabric, right? And right around COVID, things started changing because I couldn't go to shows and stuff like that. But I took on a client that was a friend at the time, and she wanted me to design this quilt. And it's like, okay, that's fine. And I gave her a good deal and all this, and I'm working on the quilt. This is why I don't do commission quilting anymore. Is she decided that I was cheating her, and she threatened to sue me. That I'm a small business, and so I'm going to sue you for... And I'm like, what are you talking about? There's this whole ordeal, and it may not be specific to quilting itself, but like I still haven't finished that quilt since that ordeal. It was all settled and taken care of, but it really left a bad taste, and like I haven't done commission quilting since. Right? And that quilt has been like banished to a box up on the upper top shelf, and like it's in timeout for I don't know how long. But outside circumstances can really taint a project. It took me a while. It took me like a year or two after that to really want to come back and do quilting again. And it's really a shame that I let that have such a huge influence, because quilting is such a creative outlet for me in so many different ways. But it's hard not to let experiences like that have a huge impact on us.
Yeah. I'm sorry that happened to you.
Oh, it's one of the things that I've always told myself, don't do business with friends or family. Just don't do it. There's always going to end. And I was like, this one time, and I'm like, all right, I'll make an exception. And I knew in the pit of my stomach, like, this was a bad idea. So I learned to listen to my gut more.
What has drawn you to making quilts rather than using your time on anything else?
It's kind of twofold. I make quilts so I can express myself, firstly. Whether I really think about it when I'm drawing a quilt or designing a quilt, sometimes I'll design something, I don't know why I'm doing it. And then when it's done and I'll look at it and I'll be like, oh, that's what I was trying to say. That's what I subconsciously was trying to express, right? And then the other part of it, at this point, since I've started writing patterns, it's just a matter of giving people the tools for them to see that they can express themselves too. And to kind of just leave that legacy behind. My kids will have my quilts if they want them, right? And I hope that they can see what I was trying to say to them in my work.
You can tell by looking at your website that you put so much into your quilts.
I love quilting. I'm so lucky to be able to do what I do and to make the quilts that I make. I don't take that for granted. I feel very blessed in that way.
Mm-hmm. Who do you usually make your quilts for?
I make them for me, I think. And mainly when I make my quilts, I'll go back, and I'm in the middle of working on a dragonfly quilt right now. There's so much symbology for me in the creatures and flowers and things that I use in my designs. And a dragonfly is my mother. Like, that's a creature that she has. She has dragonfly, stained glass lamps in her house and that kind of thing. So I can't help but see her when I make that dragonfly. I made a koi fish quilt last year. This is something about me that you'll learn quickly is I don't think before I talk. I don't think before I draw. Sometimes it just happens. And when I was done, I looked at that koi fish quilt and all these memories rushed back of like my grandfather and his koi fish pond and just those experiences with him, and like some of the few times that he opened up to me, because he was that super traditional, reserved businessman. But it was just one of those few times where he opened up like that, and it meant so much. And so right now, a lot of that is making for me, whether it's honoring somebody in my memory or expressing myself. I'm selfish and I make quilts for me, I guess.
Well, they're beautiful. So obviously, it's not just you, you're sharing with the world. Can you tell us what you're working on right now, or is it a secret that you have to keep for a while?
I have 3 big projects that I'm working on right now. I can't show anything or give you guys any sneak peeks, but I can tell you about them. 2 of them, one's the dragonfly that I mentioned, and another is a chameleon. And they both include English paper piecing in them, which I am a huge lover of English paper piecing, and being able to find a way to combine a more modern applique technique like raw edge, which seems like such a fast, easy way to do it, to a slow, more methodical, geometric procedure like English paper piecing can be, has been such a fun juxtaposition of techniques and just feels. That's the one thing I've always loved about creating with fabric. Like, I love to draw and I love to paint and those kinds of things, but I could never get the depth that I wanted. But with fabric, with quilting, each fabric is its own canvas of color and texture. And then I'm just layering all those different components together, and it adds such a depth that I couldn't get alone with just paint or with pencil without making it muddy. It's just not in my skill set. So it's been really fun working on those projects. And then I have a jellyfish project. It's the largest project that I've made to date. It's like 66 by 88. I wanted to make an art applique quilt that was big enough to snuggle with, so that we could have it on the couch and like the kids could be snuggled in it. And of course, it's all raw edge applique. So I decided in my infinite wisdom to satin stitch everything. And it took 80 hours of satin stitching this quilt just so we could actually use it. And when we wash it, it be able to be used again without fraying. And then I paired it with some traditional piecing, which I love, again, the juxtaposition of the very angular and geometric forms with the more fluid, curved forms that I can draw and manage with applique. So it's been really fun.
Something to look forward to seeing.
Yeah.
Share a quilting tip that you like to give.
So, as a woodworker, one of the first things that I learned was that your pencil has a width, right? It's a pencil line. Why should that have such a big impact? But in woodworking, it's so important to be so precise. And moving over into quilting, it's the same way. So when you're making half square triangle units, for example, if I'm using a chalk pencil that isn't sharpened, it's going to have a blunt line. All right, so am I doing on the outside or the inside of the line? As long as you can decide to be consistent and always sew on one side, you're going to find your piecing to be more precise.
Isn't it amazing how that small width, just adding that little extra every time, could throw it so far off?
And it doesn't matter if it's traditional piecing or applique. If I'm doing an applique piece and I use a thick Sharpie versus a thin Sharpie, that's going to affect everything fitting together. It's a puzzle, right? And if you want all of your pieces to consistently fit well, you have to be consistent on where you're cutting or where you're marking.
Mm-hmm. Describe how you went from having quilting as your hobby and it turned into a business for you.
Like I mentioned previously, there was a time quilting's always been an outlet for me. And it went from normal, oh, I'm a beginner quilter, I'm going to get these magazines, do quick quilts and go, to, okay, well, how about I try and take some of my drawings and let's turn them into quilts. And then that was like really getting myself excited, and people started commissioning me for all sorts of different things, whether it was like World of Warcraft themed quilts or what have you. And so that kind of shifted from there into the commission quilting and art quilting. I would make quilts and have them shown in AQS shows and Quilt Odyssey when it was around. And it was really enjoyable. You can still consider yourself a professional, right? As long as you're being paid for it. But then life happens, and I got a divorce and I moved, and then COVID hit. Oh my goodness. That was like such a huge transition for all of us. And through the divorce, I had gone through like not wanting to quilt at all, not doing anything. And I got really sick 2 weeks after giving birth to my son in 2020. And it was that realization of, I want to quilt again. I'm not done. Life is not done for me. I'm going to keep going. So then I decided after that point to transition from art commission quilting and quilt shows and things over into quilt pattern writing. So I spent about 2 years learning Adobe Suite and all those kinds of things and learning how to talk with fabric companies on a more professional level, all that kind of stuff. And now I am running a quilt pattern business and really loving it.
You mentioned you decided to try turning your drawings into quilts. Had you seen that done, or this was just imagined in your mind and you brought it to life?
I knew applique existed, and I'd seen work from Lynette Anderson, and my mom was really big into prim quilting and that kind of thing. And I was just so unimpressed with the patterns that she would buy, because it just literally looked like little doodles. Don't get me wrong, I think it doesn't matter our skill set, we can all create and we can all do work and stuff. And I thought, well, if this person can draw a sheep and people like it, then why can't I take my drawings? And my work, especially then, was more fantasy based. Like my first art applique quilt was a fairy. Like was this punk fairy with knee-high boots and spikes and like fishnet. It was so wild and different than anything else I'd really seen. And I just kind of continued with that. And like the first quilt that I had in an AQS show was this druid character, because I named it Maternal Nature. And it was this druid woman holding a deer set in a swampy location with antlers coming out of her head. And it was just really kind of fantastical for me. And it still had a huge impact emotionally, because like I was a first time mother when I made that. And I was kind of just learning my way through where my balance was. But it was fun because I could work with fur and I could work with yarn and my quilting and all that kind of stuff and experiment more that I really wasn't seeing done in that way at that time.
It's neat to hear how that all came about. Thanks for sharing. So share the name of your business and how did you come up with the name?
My business is called Art Quilts by Design. I jumped around from a couple different names through the progression of my business. At one time we were called Hamster Handcrafts. Like that was just but I settled on Art Quilts by Design when I transitioned over to pattern writing and being more serious about my business, because in my opinion, all quilts are a work of art. Doesn't matter if it's a traditional or quick quilt or whatever. It still is a labor of love and takes skill and technique, and you're putting something out into the world for people to enjoy. So that really kind of resonated with me, and I wanted to still be able to create art quilts, but I wanted people to understand that they could take and make it their own. You know, I make these designs of my art quilts. You can do this. You can create it. So that's kind of where my business name came from. Nice.
It is a journey coming through all of that, starting with hamsters down to...
Yeah. And I hated that name so much, but it was just something that had gotten stuck to me, and I was like just rolling with it at the time. So.
And how long have you had Art Quilts by Design?
I have been running my business now about 12 years in total, from like conception of starting to do commission quilting and all that kind of stuff to now. I've been running it.
I'm trying to remember how long they say we have to work at something for it to be an overnight success.
A long time.
So you started making patterns. Do you remember the first time you sold a pattern to someone you did not know?
I do. It wasn't that long ago. I think it was 2 years ago now. No, 2.5. Wow. It was my first pattern. And again, it was English paper piecing and applique paired together. And I just decided to launch it and put it out into the world. I'd been working on it on stream and designing and things like that for over a year to get to that point. I'm a lot faster now, thankfully. The launch went really well. I think I sold 11 in the first month, which was like insane to me that somebody would want to buy something I designed. It was reassuring that this is the right path that I chose, that things are progressing in the direction that they need to be.
Yeah. It's funny how we look at these numbers at times. And I started podcasting in very early, first few, and 6 people downloaded it. It's like, okay, there's my goal, 6. So I reach my goal every time a podcast comes out.
Yeah. I love that.
It is fun when someone you don't know appreciates your work.
Well, and it's even more so, I think, selling that first pattern, it was a digital sale, so there wasn't any connection or communication there. But then when I got my first interaction of somebody saying, hey, I bought your pattern and I loved making it. Now that was like emotionally like, holy moly. You get goosebumps and you like giggle inside because they look at you like, oh, you're some big thing. And I'm like, nah, hon, I'm just like you. I'm just kind of just quilting to have fun. And you like what I do. And that makes me excited.
It does. And you also started doing workshops. How long have you been doing workshops, and what workshops do you have to offer?
I have 2 different kind of sides of my workshops, and I've been doing them for about 2 years now. I have one side that is like the normal quilting side. Okay, this is how we do art applique, and oh, this is how we do English paper piecing, and I have those kinds of classes. I really enjoy doing those because then I can connect to actual quilters and give them tips that maybe they've never seen or done before, and then reassure them. I can't tell you how many people I have met who hated applique, that start applique, and then I reassure them because they're like, well, I didn't do it exactly like this, and I didn't do it like, honey, the pearl clutchers are not here. The quilt police are not going to come bust down your door because you cut your flower in a different way. Like, this is an expression of you, right? So there's that series of workshops that I do, mainly virtual. I haven't really gotten the opportunity with my son being so young to be able to travel to guilds yet. It starts kindergarten this year, so I'm hoping 2026 will be when I can actually start traveling to guilds and doing those kinds of events. And then the other side of my workshops, I do some more business side of things. I am very familiar with Twitch live streaming, so I've given lectures on being a streamer. I've done workshops on OBS, which is Open Broadcast Studio. For anyone out there that's interested, it's free. You can kind of go down that rabbit hole if you want. And then Discord as well. I'm big on community building. And so like I have a Discord community for all sorts of different things, whether it's pattern testers or local business owners and people from my community who are quilters. I teach on how to use Discord and the kinds of things that you can use Discord to do.
That sounds like something I need to look into.
I always suggest it, especially if you're big into community building and you want to be able to do things like Zoom calls and stuff. They have all of that worked into there. So I love it.
Where do you get to display your art quilts?
There's a couple different places. Because I'm working more in pattern writing, I work with a lot of fabric companies and catalogs. So my quilts get to go displayed there. We just, at Fall Market this past year, my quilt Desert Spring was featured on their cover for Island Boutique, which was just like insane to me. So that was really exciting. And then it was on the back of the program for Fall Market, which still boggles my mind. And then I also still put into international shows. So the same quilt Desert Spring will be in Daytona in February. And then it's going over to Branson after that.
Wow. So some of your quilts get to travel around.
It does. And it's exciting. It kind of feels like I'm returning back to my base, being able to not only write a pattern for it, but also to still be able to do quality enough work that it gets accepted into these international shows. It's such an honor. Otherwise, they're just like displayed all over my house. Like, I feel like every quilt can be a wall hanging. So you should see my kitchen. I have like 5 quilts all hanging up, and none of them go together. But I love them. I just love looking at my quilts and being like, yeah, I did that.
What else about your business would you like to share?
As far as my business is concerned, I am venturing into online courses. I'm working with C&T for their Creative Spark program. So I'm venturing into teaching my patterns that way and teaching my skills. So there's more of a broader audience that can access them.
Nice. It sounds like people are really enjoying taking classes and having their stash and everything at home.
Especially with the weather we've been having. I don't know about where you're at, but it is cold, and I sure as heck do not want to go out right now.
And Sondrasa, share where we can find you online.
The easiest place to find me and all my shenanigans is at artquiltsbydesign.com. You'll find all sorts of different links to blogs and courses, and I do have a YouTube channel that is having tutorials for applique and those kinds of techniques. So if you need more one-on-one, you can always join the Discord too.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Was there anything else?
This has been really fantastic. Thank you for sharing your podcast with me, and this has been a lovely experience.
Oh, good. Thanks. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
You can find more stories on aquilterslife.com or subscribe on your favorite podcast player so each episode will be downloaded automatically. Also, I want to hear about you and your wonderful quilts. Please contact me, Paula Chamberlain, through the website to set up an interview. And as always, thanks for listening.